Video, we'll go over how to build a simple dataset object. And just to note, there's a lot you can do with the dataset object in PyTorch, and we're only scratching the surface. So this is a basic class for dataset object, and we'll import datasets from utilities.data, and our class toy_set will subclass this abstract class. So there's a few things we have to realize. So in this course, we're going to use the output of the dataset as a tuple, and we'll call it x and y. And we're going to have to override the Python method getItem, as well as the Python method length. So let's see an example of how this dataset works by constructing a dataset object. So we'll construct a dataset object, dataset, from our dataset. And our data attributes x and y will contain a tensor of 2s and a tensor of 1. And just a note, you may not always be able to contain the data within your dataset, and you'll have to start from memory. And there's a great tutorial in the PyTorch documentation to do that. When we call the length of the dataset, as you recall in the constructor, we assign the attribute self.length to the actual length of our dataset. And because we overrid the method length, it'll jump to this and return the length. So when we use the square brackets, this is analogous to calling the Python method getItems, and the argument will be the index, in this case 0. And we'll simply obtain the element of x and y for that particular index, and using our table representation, it's those two values. And I'll assign them to samples and return the values. And again, this will be x and y for the majority of the course. So if we vary the argument of the dataset index, it will return the different values. So for the first value, this will be 0. We'll return the first element of x and y, assign it to sample, and return it. And I'll do this for the next few indexes. So one really cool thing about PyTorch is the transforms option. So we create a class. So all transforms are classes, and they must contain and they must override the call method. So there's several ways to do it, but first let's see what happens when we create a dataset object without using transforms. So we'll create it to a dataset, and because transforms is set to none, this value, the attribute self.transforms, will be set to none. So when we return the sample, we're essentially going to ignore this. We're essentially going to ignore this part of our code, and we'll just return the sample directly. So the first way to use transforms is to create an object of that class, and we'll call it a_m, and we can apply it directly to the dataset sample we want. So if you recall, initially the values were 2 and 1. So when we use the object and we apply our data sample as an argument, the first element of the tuple will be assigned to x, and that corresponds to this element, and the second element of the tuple corresponding to this element will be assigned to y. And then we'll add the value of x, which is the default parameters, in this case 1. And we'll multiply this value, self.multiply y, and we'll multiply y by this value, which we initialize in our class constructor. And then we'll assign it to sample and return the sample. And as you can see, the values, the first element of x incremented by 1, and the value of y is multiplied by 1. So another way is to create the transform object and apply it to the dataset object constructor. So we create a transform object, and then when we construct our dataset in the object constructor, the parameter transforms will be set to our transform, in this case the object a_m. So we can call the first index, and what happens is it'll assign the values to sample x and sample y, but instead of returning the actual samples, it'll apply the transform to the data and apply the result. So sometimes you may want to perform multiple transforms, and PyTorch has a useful function called transform compose. So let's go over an example how that works. So here we have two classes representing two transforms. We'll add a number to x and multiply a number by y, which we discussed earlier. In the second class, multiply, we'll multiply every element by 100. So Torch Vision has a useful package called transforms, and a useful function is transform compose. So transform compose takes two transform objects, and then what it does is it'll apply both transforms. So we'll take an input, it'll apply the first transform, and then apply the second transform, and return the value. So in this case, our object is called data_transform, and when we create our dataset object for the parameter transforms, we'll set it equal to our data_transform object, and for the first element, it'll call the index function, and it'll apply the following transforms. So here's the original data. We'll add 1 to the tensor x, and multiply 1 by tensor y, and then it will multiply both tensors by 100. And that's it.